I'm pleased to uh, uh, be able to talk to you about a number of quite interesting issues. The theme I want to come to in the end is how a large number of events, most importantly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also COVID-19, have contributed to creating a new economic paradigm. But I want to begin a little bit in the past, and that is with the transition from communism to a market economy, an event that started before most of you were born, back at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. Communism had arisen out of a sense of exploitation and a sense of worker solidarity in response to that exploitation. The experience of many workers after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution at the end of the previous century had been very adverse. Standards of living, life expectancy had gone down. And communism offered an alternative economic model, one that replaced the market with centralized decision-making. There were some initial successes particularly in industrialization. But those successes were at a huge cost, not only of oppression, but they had to be financed, and the finance was taken in part by taking the goods of the rural sector, and Ukraine suffered a great deal in that process. 80 years ago, textbooks in the United States and Western Europe actually contemplated the idea that the Russian model might be more successful, but the costs were excessive. All that's changed in what happened in the beginning of the 50s and 60s and 70s showed that you couldn't manage a complex society centrally. The information requirements were just too great. There was a moment of optimism when computers were just being invented, that computers would be able to handle that process of centralized planning. But even the most advanced computers could not handle the information requirements. They couldn't gather the information that was required, let alone process it. The result of that and other problems associated with the lack of incentives was that the communist system collapsed, and thus began the transition, hopefully, was hoped to be, to our market economy. There had been only one other case of such a transition, and that was China. And China's transition was both more complex and in many ways quite different. China kept its authoritarian communist government, but it softened the edges. On the other hand, it moved quickly towards a market economy. It was a kind of irony that they used their potential of control to move the economy away from a controlled economy. And there were many, many differences between the course taken by China beginning in the early 80s, late 70s, and that by Russia and the other countries of Eastern Europe. There were differences in theories. It was clear that you couldn't do everything at one time. The question was, you had to make choices. What choices should one make as, you might say, second best measures as the transition proceeded? China took an approach which is often referred to as gradualism. It emphasized competition. It emphasized building up certain institutions. I was lucky that at the very beginning of that transition, the Chinese government asked me and a few others to come to China to discuss the strategy that they were following. Russia, on the other hand, took a quite different strategy. It was marked not by gradualism, but by shock therapy. It was marked not by competition, but by privatization, often into large monopolies. Rather than slowly building up institutions, the theory was that institutions would follow privatization. It seemed to me, and we had a very active debate among academics around the world about which of these two courses was likely to be most successful. Interestingly, many macroeconomists who didn't spend much time understanding the underlying structures of the economy argued for shock therapy. People like Jeff Sachs, Larry Summers are the prototype. Interestingly, some of those who argued for the move towards a market economy through shock therapy got engaged in the very corruption that they were attacking and have been convicted of that. Well, while we had an active debate about the relative success, what would be the relative success of these alternative strategies in the beginning, we now have 30, 40 years of data. The economic transition in China was very successful. It's not over. There are potential for failures going forward that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But in terms of the economic transition, per capita incomes rose enormously. They created vibrant firms. Standards of living went up. Poverty, more than 750 million people moved out of poverty, the most successful anti-poverty program ever. They didn't have full shared prosperity. Inequality grew. But at least those at the bottom got a significant part of the gains so that they were able to move out of poverty. Russia's move was far less successful. It had, in an earlier era, been a more diversified economy. It became increasingly dependent on Western goods and services. It became, in many ways, a natural resource economy. That accounts, on the one hand, for why the sanctions against Russia have had so big of an effect on natural resource prices, in particular gas and oil. But it also accounts for why I think eventually the sanctions will work. Russia does not have the capability of making many of the key ingredients of a modern economy, like chips, particularly advanced chips. And so long as the sanctions are universally applied and there's no major circumvention, it is hard to see how Russia can sustain its economic system. As we look at these two experiences, they've had a lot of influence on how we think about economics more generally. And the lessons that we've drawn from that turn out to coincide with lessons that we've learned from other aspects, other economic developments in the last 30 years, including the great financial crisis in the United States and Europe in 2008, the growth of inequality in the United States and Europe and most market economies, the failures of development in Africa. In short, the economic model that was used to frame thinking for the economic transition in Russia was what is called the Neoliberal Model, that was predicated on putting markets at the center of all activity, and downplayed the importance of the role of government and other institutions. The Washington consensus policies that were at the center of the IMF and the World Bank at the time not only informed the transition of Russia to a market economy, but also informed the policies that they advocated for the developing world. China, on the other hand, ignored these ideas. It was much more selective. It said markets are important. Markets are an important institution that we have to develop, but markets can't do everything. And there's a role for government, not only in creating the institutions that make markets work, like competition policy, corporate governance policies, policies for human capital, for education, policies for health. Well, that leads us to the question, where are we now? We are at a very particular moment in history. China, in spite of its economic success, seems to be moving towards more authoritarianism. I suspect that if that trend continues, it will be hard to see how we'll be able to sustain the kind of innovation that is the mark of a modern economy. Russia is an authoritarian state. Interestingly, the US launched what might be called a preemptive economic Cold War against China. The interesting aspect of that is that even though the world, Europe, United States, are engaged with this, trying to help Ukraine to fight this terrible invasion by Russia, the fact is that over the long run, authorities in the United States continue to see China as the major long-run threat. And one reason you can see that is that Russia, as an economy as a whole, is the size of Spain. It's not a big economy. On the other hand, China is a big economy. In the way economists measure the size of an economy, which is called PPP, purchasing power parity, China in 2015 became larger than the United States. And with 4 to 5 times the population, and with its growth rate continuing to exceed that of the United States, its dominance, its relative strength in the global economy inevitably will get larger and larger. I'm concerned about this new Cold War because what we realized in the midst of the pandemic is that we need to cooperate. There are global public goods. We have to cooperate in not only in dealing with the pandemic, but also in dealing with climate change. And we will have to learn how to cooperate even as we compete for the hearts and minds of those everywhere in the world. I've also been disappointed in the way the United States has been waging this battle for the third world. We lost support by vaccine apartheid, vaccine nationalism that was part of both the United States and European policies. The consequence of that is that globally, support for what the United States and Europe are doing in Ukraine is much weaker than I would have expected. What those in the third world realize, feel, is that they're paying a high price in terms of higher energy and higher food prices, and they're not getting any solidarity, any assistance from the advanced countries. There's a standard joke in the third world that what you get from China is economic assistance. What you get from the United States is an economic lecture on what you should do. So all of this leads to a concern about how this is going to play out in the coming years. There's one other factor that I want to emphasize, and I can't emphasize enough. The US democracy is very fragile. One of the two parties is not committed to democracy. One of the two parties attempted to interfere with the peaceful transition of economic power. And how this plays out going forward, we simply do not know. Let me now turn to a few remarks about Ukraine. There's been, as all of you know, enormous destruction, and there will have to be reconstruction. At the same time, the reconstruction of the physical infrastructure has to be accompanied by the construction of what is sometimes called the soft infrastructure, the legal frameworks, the institutional frameworks. The transition for Ukraine from communism to a market economy was not what most people would say a complete transition. Like so many of the other countries in the former Soviet Union, the transition had been, shall I say, a rough one with successes and failures. This itself is both an opportunity and a challenge. It is, I think, a particular opportunity because the evidence is overwhelming that when a country fights together, it develops a kind of social solidarity that enables it to solve problems collectively that it otherwise could not have solved. The most successful period in the United States and in Europe were the decades following World War II. These were periods of our most rapid economic growth and in which there was shared prosperity with those at the bottom having higher growth than those at the top. The ideas that were accepted, the solidarity that was expressed, enabled this to be accomplished. Eisenhower, General Eisenhower was a Republican, but he was a Republican that shared democratic values. That cannot be said about a very large fraction of those in the Republican Party today. So what was developed then was a mixture of collective action combined with individual responsibility. So for my final set of remarks, I want to talk about what is emerging around the world, what is sometimes called the new paradigm, the post-neoliberal paradigm, the post-Washington consensus paradigm. There are several key ingredients of this new paradigm. The first is a better balance between the market and the state. The critical failure of neoliberalism is that it put markets, unfettered markets, at the center. The belief was that markets on their own would lead to economic efficiency and shared prosperity. There was never any evidence or theory behind that set of ideas. For me, it was particularly interesting that these ideas became fashionable in the United States and Europe in the 1980s, after I had done some of my fundamental work, for which I got the Nobel Prize, showing that markets in general are not efficient. I had shown that whenever there was imperfect asymmetric information and incomplete risk markets, that is always the reason the invisible hand seemed invisible was that it wasn't there. Markets were not efficient. There was an important role for government in promoting, in regulation, so important, particularly now that we face huge externalities like climate change, like pandemic. But you also need government for basic investments in R&D, technology, education, and in the case of Ukraine, for rebuilding the infrastructure. So the first pillar of the post-neoliberal vision is a better balance between the market and the state. The second pillar is going to be a broader range of institutions. I think it's a mistake to narrow our analysis down to just public or private. We've seen the most successful institutions in the United States are universities. And all of our universities, with a few exceptions, are neither private nor public in the usual sense. Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, Yale are all foundations, not-for-profit organizations, and they've been enormously successful. There is no successful private university in the United States. The only successful for-profit private university, the only a representative of the for-profit private universities is Trump University, which succeeded only in exploiting people and for which it paid an enormous fine. We have good state universities like California and good nonprofits and universities like Columbia, but the for-profit sector has been a total disaster. And there are similar questions that can be raised about the healthcare sector and other vital sectors of our economy. So I urge you, as you think about the post-war vision of Ukraine, to think about the important role that civil society and a whole range of other institutions can play. Thirdly, there will be a reordering of globalization. In the aftermath of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama wrote a very influential book called The End of History. He argued that with the end of the Cold War, we would inevitably converge to liberal democracies and free market economies. Well, His view from current perspective seems Pollyannish and obviously foolish. I thought so at the time. What we've seen, beginning with President Trump, is that borders do matter. And that sometimes bad things go across border as well as good things. Inadequate protection against financial flows led to had a consequence that bad financial regulation in the United States led to a global financial crisis. It is still the case, whether we like it or not, that the basic political unit in our society is the nation state. So there's going to have to be a reordering of globalization. The particular model that we use based on free market ideology is going to have to be altered. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we will need to have better cooperation so that that will be essential. But we won't necessarily be converging to the same economic system. And designing rules of the road that work for a world with 2 or 3 economic systems is not going to be easy. So at this point, I think there are more questions than answers. We know that what has happened in the last few years is a turning point in history. You are living through a turning point in the history of Ukraine, and we are living through a turning point in the history of the world, and a turning point in our thinking about economics and how we can design an economic system that serves society rather than the other way around. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Joseph. We have some questions for you from our participants, and I will say these questions and you can answer for them. First question we have, can we already compare sanctions against Russia and sanctions against Iran? Can we expect similar results for Russia?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was going to talk about that. The effectiveness of sanctions has been a question that's been debated, discussed for a very long time. When I was in the Clinton administration 30 years ago, we had a debate about precisely that question. And I think there's a broad consensus. Sanctions can be effective. They worked against Southern Rhodesia and South Africa. They eventually succeeded in, you might say, changing the regime in both of those countries to a more democratic regime. Sanctions are only effective when they are universal, if there is, and comprehensive. If there is extensive circumvention, obviously, sanctions won't be effective. In the case of Iran and in the case of North Korea, we've made the sanctions fairly comprehensive. And that's because of the role that the US has in its extraterritoriality, that we can sanction those who disobey our sanctions. So we've had policies that incentivize others to comply with our sanctions. The big question in the case of the current Russian sanctions is, what would the role of China be? I believe that China will not actively circumvent the sanctions. The consequence for them, were to do so, would be very severe. And though most of the policymakers in China are very aware of that. So while they'll be what might be called leakages, there won't be massive circumvention. The other major determinant of success is comprehensiveness. And Europe and the West have been ratcheting up the sanctions in terms of comprehensiveness. I think that's a good thing. I wish they had done it faster, but they have been ratcheting up the sanctions. I think there is a dawning realization that if they don't cut themselves off from Russian gas, Russia may cut them off from gas, and they should do it on their own terms, not on Russia's terms. So while there are obviously some who will be more adversely affected and are opposing those measures, I think eventually Europe will come around. I wish there had been more global solidarity. The reason why I say that is that the other ingredient for the effectiveness of sanctions is persistence. As I said, in the case of Southern Rhodesia and South Africa, it took a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. And that's also going to be the case here. So one shouldn't expect miracles, but one should make sure that Europe and the West is willing to go for the long run. And that will be the case, that would be more likely to be the case if the burden, the economic burden, the sanctions, is more widely shared. And that's why I would have hoped that there would be more of a, you might call it a solidarity fund to support the sanctions.
Yeah, and what do you think, what we need, like, what should be next most important sanction on Russia?
Well, I think that what I said before in terms of where the Russian economy is, from what I've seen, the Russian economy is not a diversified economy. It has to import. So a lot of the discussion has been on circumscribing exports, depriving it of income. I think what there needs now to be more focus on circumscribing imports, depriving it of the goods that it needs to function, and particularly intermediate goods. Many of these are goods that it could not quickly replace on its own. Now, I haven't done an analysis of which of those goods are most important, but I would like there to be a comprehensive ban against exports to Russia, as well as a comprehensive impediment to imports from Russia.
And next question is about, like, what is your recommendation and advices for Ukraine recovery plan for rebuilding of economy after the war? What should be the first steps and what we should focus on?
Well, there are many complexities to that issue. One of them is obviously no one knows how long the war is going to last. And if it is going to be a long war, the process of reconstruction will have to begin even while the process of destruction is going on. So it's going to be a very frustrating process, because one will feel that Russia is tearing things down as you build them up, but it is very important to maintain the Ukrainian economy and society throughout the period of what could be a longer war. Now, as I mentioned before, while a lot of attention is given to the hard infrastructure that is visibly being destroyed, there's lots of other things going on that people in the Ukraine can assess far better than I can, that are a problem in wartime economy. Let me give you an example. There are many banks will have loans out to businesses which are not going to be able to repay them because the businesses have been destroyed. But having a functioning banking system is very important for having a functioning economy.
Absolutely.
Making sure that farmers have access to credit so they can buy seed and fertilizer is very important to a functioning economy. So the effects of a war are analogous to the effects of any major economic downturn. And the downturn in the Ukrainian economy is very large. And therefore, one has to think very carefully about how do we maintain existing institutions and make them viable to help resuscitate the economy. And that includes, as an example, the banking institutions and other institutions. And that's why when I began my remarks, I said, the challenge for Ukraine right now is not only the reconstruction of its hard infrastructure, but the maintenance, construction, and reconstruction of its institutions, including institutions like financial institutions.
Yeah, and we have one another question from our participants about your mentioning of Cold War as a second with this economic crisis. And what do you think, how long the global economic crisis will last and what needs to be done and how long will it take to rebuild the world from this crisis? And probably, I want to add that like probably you can describe your vision of general change of world economy in 10 years because of this pandemic crisis and now war crisis and general changes in actors of economy all over the world.
Yeah, let me first begin by focusing on one aspect of what is going on, which is the inflation. And it's what most people in Europe, America, developing countries, emerging markets see most visibly. The increase in prices that we've seen are largely caused by three separate factors. And each of them has their own story. The first is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that everybody knows about and how that has disrupted global energy markets, global food markets. Russia is holding up the rest of the world as hostage in this particular case, in the case of food. But that's only one. The second is we have been facing a climate crisis well before the pandemic. People in your generation will be facing the consequences. We are facing the consequences. I was on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that brought to the fore the magnitude of the climate crisis. I was on the second review in 1995. And we thought of the climate crisis as appearing sometime in the future. No longer is this the way we're seeing things. We are living climate change today. Every day we read about some dimensions or other of climate change. And the food prices are going up, would have gone up without the Ukrainian crisis because of droughts, lack of rainfall, because of climate change. So we have the Ukraine crisis combined, reinforcing a climate crisis. And then finally, the pandemic. Now, what the pandemic showed was that markets, for all the praise that's been given to them, are not resilient. And we even know why they're not resilient. They are extraordinarily short-sighted. In 2006, I wrote a book called Making Globalization Work, where I said it was so foolish for Germany to become so dependent on Russian gas. What rational country would make itself so dependent on Russian gas? Russia was not a stable country. Well, 16 years later, my worries proved correct. Well, the point I want to make out of this is that markets do not think well, do not do a good job about risk, about time. When I criticize the markets, there's ample reason to criticize markets. And that's why there has to be an array of economic institutions. So we are, the third point is important because as the world emerged from the pandemic, many people, including me, thought that the supply side interruptions would be short-lived and prices will come down. Well, it appears that these supply side failures are much deeper than we had thought, and that they will take longer to work them out. Well, all this is a reminder of the limits of markets, the limits of globalization, and the need for addressing the climate change issue. So you asked the question, where do I see the world going after these multiple crises, and how long will we be in it? Well, this again emphasizes something that I've highlighted in much of my work, which is there is, you might call it, deep uncertainty. These are not events that have well-defined probability distributions. These are events that are one of a kind. We sometimes describe them by terms like non-stationary stochastic processes. The fact is, we don't know when the pandemic will disappear, and we don't know when the next pandemic will appear. We are fairly sure that the climate crisis is going to get worse, and fairly quickly. We don't know when Russia will stop this invasion. So there are some questions that nobody can pretend to know the answer to. We can say we're hopeful. We're hopeful that Russia finally sees the light of day, that the devastation to the Russian economy, there was never any good rationale for the invasion, but there's now increasing evidence that it was such a bad idea that maybe rationality, which the economists think of as at the core of human behavior, rationality will eventually win out. But we don't know, and that's one of the dangers of having authoritarian leaders. It was a danger of Putin, it's a danger of somebody like Trump. So what we can do, though, is to begin to address each of these issues. We don't have to wait to know all the answer to the question when we are going to be over. We can begin to work on creating a more resilient economy, and we're already beginning to do that. We discovered the problem. We can create a more climate-friendly economy, and we should be doing that, the green economy. We can create a different kind of globalization, and we can create a better market economy with more shared prosperity. So my answer to the question is we don't know exactly when the current crises are going to be over, but we shouldn't wait until they're over before we begin our work in constructing a new economic agenda.
Professor, can you assess and share your assessment of the Lend-Lease program for Ukraine, and what is your mention about kind of U.S. Marshall Plan? Is it the right approach for future?
Well, there are two. There are several aspects of this. The use of the term Marshall Plan is intended to evoke the idea that it's going to have to be a large amount of money, a large amount of assistance. And that's very clear. It will have to be a large amount to repair the damage that has been done. The question about Lend-Lease raises the issue, should it be loans or grants? And as you may know, Ukraine was having a hard time before the Russian invasion paying its debts. And more debt is obviously not the answer. The Lend-Lease program in the United States was an answer to a political problem in the United States. It was an answer to the question of how we could come to the aid of Europe, given the political domestic constraints and international constraints at the time. So it's hard to assess what those constraints that are at play today are, but from the point of view of an economist, the right answer is almost surely mostly grants, with maybe some mix of highly concessional loans.
And thank you very much for that. And we have two questions, very much, I will try to combine them for you. What is your vision of who should play a key role in the reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine? The state, the private sector, international partners, and or NGOs, something like that. And are Ukrainian institutions viable implementing partners, or would they like to see a new agency involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine with, I mean, international partners, etc.?
Sure. I think that one wants to engage all the institutions, domestic and international, that are willing to work towards Ukraine's reconstruction. The lead has to be, in some sense, Ukrainian, Ukraine reconstructing its own economy. But obviously, to the extent that there is money being given by other countries, those other countries will have to comfort that the money is being well spent. That's the nature of democratic processes. You want to give aid, but you want to make sure the aid does what you believe it should be doing. I also believe that when the aid framework, the reconstruction framework, is designed correctly, it can help strengthen domestic institutions. What do I mean by that? What I mean that is that we've had some experience when I was at the World Bank and elsewhere, where rather than having international companies come in and do the construction, having domestic companies do at least some of the construction, helps develop those domestic companies and diversify the economy. So I believe that every reconstruction effort should be viewed through a development transformation lens. How can we think of the money that we're spending doing double, triple, quadruple purpose? And by that, I mean, making sure that it promotes equality, promotes learning and a more innovative economy, a digital economy, promotes a green economy, promotes the creation of domestic entrepreneurship, promotes greater equality by, say, being more labor intensive. There are a whole set of social objectives, and the reconstruction expenditures should be always viewed through that broader transformational lens. And if that's done, I think there is a better prospect that by this mix of domestic and international institutions, the strength of Ukrainian institutions will be enhanced.
We have next question. What could be a driving force to the global economy to go forward from probable stagnation?
I didn't quite hear that.
Yeah, what could be a driving force for the global economy to go forward from probable stagnation?
For the global economy, it seems to me clear that climate change is likely to be the most important driver. We have to retrofit the global economy for dealing with the problems of climate change, moving out of fossil fuels, moving out of dirty industrial production. We have to change our patterns of consumption, our patterns of how we organize our cities. When you reconstruct the cities, try to make them green cities. There's just an enormous amount of work to be done. So one of the previous questions about the uncertainties that we're facing right now, the World Bank came out with a report a couple of days ago, worried about a global recession. If we move into a global recession, I believe it's a result of a failure of policy of an enormous magnitude. A recession means that we are leaving scarce resources idle. We shouldn't be doing that. Every available resource should be used to solve the enormous global problems that we have. In the case of Ukraine, it's the reconstruction. In the case of the world, it's the retrofitting of the economy to a green economy. In the developing emerging world, it's education and construction of the infrastructure. It is construction of the healthcare systems. It is, to me, intolerable, unconscionable that we're talking about having resources idle that want to work. And if that is the case, it is a statement that we are about to have a major failure of macroeconomic policy.
And Professor, we have a question. What should Ukraine be focused during reconstruction? Like, based on your talk before, can you summarize like main 3 points, what we should go up with our discussion with government and public? All will be involved in reconstruction and recovery. Even how you said during the war, during destruction, we will reconstruct our country and we will fight for our freedom and we will try to rebuild economy during the period of war. What like main 3 or 4 points you can summarize as an advice for Ukrainian economy, for Ukrainian society, for Ukrainian people, what we should do next couple of years to build strong economy and to make this transition from the past to the future very, 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 very effective?
Well, what I'm trying to emphasize that you need this balance between the market and the state, a broad set of institutions, state, non-state, NGOs, collective institutions, collective action, an open mind about how one goes about it, pragmatic as opposed to ideological, what works. To me, one of the most important things is to maintain the spirit of solidarity that Ukraine has shown in the last 100 days. That solidarity that the entire world has admired and looked on with enormous awe. That solidarity has to be maintained in the reconstruction phase. And that means that there has to be a focus on what I called before shared prosperity. And shared prosperity not only within the current generation, but recognizing that, especially with climate change, we're talking about shared prosperity between the current generation and future generations.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time of your hour, and we have 2 minutes more. If you want to share any final remarks with Ukrainian community and Ukrainian society.
Well, yeah, I guess repeat what I just said, that you have shown the world the meaning of courage, the meaning of persistence, and hopefully you will continue to show that courage, persistence, and solidarity. One of the things I think that people around the world have also seen is the innovativeness of young Ukrainians. That the image of Ukraine has changed dramatically. And that's because the young people have been shown to be so tech savvy, so aware of what is going on in other countries. Part of, you might call, the rest of the world, it's shown a different picture than what people often had in the past. And if one can continue to show those qualities, I think Ukraine will be in good stead in this very difficult period coming up and in the reconstruction that will follow.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much you personally, and thank you very much US people for your support, outstanding support of Ukraine. Thank you very much, and we
Thank
hope
you.
We can.
We all wish we could do more to support anything we can to support Ukraine.
Yeah, and we hope we will make something great together between us and between our nations. Thank you very much.
That's right. Thank you.